The day after my daughter's wedding, the photographer sent me a USB. What he showed me proved I needed to leave my house immediately. The betrayal was deeper than anything I could have imagined. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Rose, and I'm 72 years old. I live alone in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens, where the walls are thin and the neighbors' arguments bleed through like unwelcome visitors. The morning light filters through my dusty blinds, casting long shadows across my worn linoleum floor. My hands shake slightly as I pour my morning coffee into the same chipped mug I've used for 15 years. The silence in my apartment is deafening, broken only by the distant hum of traffic on Northern Boulevard and the occasional siren that reminds me how isolated I've become in this concrete jungle. I wear the same faded blue robe every morning, the one my daughter Sarah gave me 3 Christmases ago. It's the only gift from her that still fits properly. My gray hair is always pulled back in the same loose bun, and my reading glasses hang from a chain around my neck, like a badge of my advancing age. The smell of instant coffee mingles with the faint mustiness of old carpet, and the lingering scent of the lavender candle I light every evening to mask my loneliness. My living room is a shrine to memories I'm no longer sure are real. Wedding photos crowd my mantel, their silver frames catching what little sunlight manages to penetrate my windows. There's Sarah in her white dress, radiant and beautiful, standing next to Marcus, her new husband. There's my son David, looking uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo. And there's me, pushed slightly to the side in every group photo, smiling that practiced smile I've perfected over decades of pretending everything is fine. The wedding had filled me with such hope. For months, I had dreamed it would be a new beginning for our family. That maybe, finally, the years of cold shoulders and forgotten phone calls would melt away in the warmth of celebration. I had spent my entire life savings on that wedding. $23,000 from my retirement account, money I had scraped together from decades of working double shifts as a home health aide, money that was supposed to be my safety net. But hope is a dangerous thing when you're desperate for love. The morning after the wedding, I sat in my kitchen staring at my phone. No text messages, no calls, not even a simple thank you from Sarah or David. The silence felt like a slap across my face. I had hosted the rehearsal dinner at my expense, paid for Sarah's dress alterations, covered the cost of the flowers when the original florist canceled. I had done everything a mother should do and more. Yet here I was, alone, surrounded by leftover wedding favors that no one wanted to take home. That's when the knock came at my door. I shuffled across my apartment in my worn slippers, my arthritic knees protesting with each step. Through the peephole, I saw a young man holding a manila envelope. He was the wedding photographer's assistant, a kid who couldn't have been more than 25, with kind eyes and an apologetic smile. "Mrs. Martinez?" he asked when I opened the door. "I have something for you from Jeremy, the photographer. He asked me to deliver this personally." Inside the envelope was a USB drive and a handwritten note. The note was brief. "Mrs. Martinez, there were some additional photos that weren't included in the main collection. I thought you should see them. I'm sorry, Jeremy." My hands trembled as I held the small plastic device. Something about the way the young man had looked at me, something about the photographer's cryptic note, filled me with dread. But I was desperate for any connection to my family, any evidence that I had mattered on my daughter's most important day. I plugged the USB into my ancient laptop, the one David had given me years ago when he upgraded to something newer. The screen flickered to life, and I held my breath as the files loaded. What I saw changed everything. The photos weren't the posed, perfect shots from the official wedding album. These were candid moments, stolen glimpses behind the curtain of what should have been the happiest day of our lives. There was Sarah standing in the corner of the bridal suite, whispering furiously into her phone while her bridesmaids got dressed. Her face was twisted with anger, her perfect makeup unable to hide the venom in her expression. But that wasn't the worst part. In photo after photo, I saw myself being deliberately excluded. While I thought I was sharing precious moments with my family, they were actively avoiding me. There was David, rolling his eyes as I approached with my camera. There was Sarah's new mother-in-law, Carol, making faces behind my back as I gave my toast. There was my own daughter, pretending to listen to my stories while texting on her phone, her expression one of barely contained irritation. And then I saw them, photos of Sarah and a man I didn't recognize. They were taken during the reception, in a quiet corner of the venue where they thought no one was watching. But Jeremy had captured everything with his telephoto lens. Sarah's hand on this stranger's chest, his lips brushing against her ear, the way she looked at him, with a passion I had never seen her direct toward Marcus, her new husband. The man was older, distinguished looking, wearing an expensive suit and a Rolex that caught the camera flash. In one photo, Sarah was showing him something on her phone, bank statements, from what I could make out. In another, he was handing her what looked like a business card. They were making plans, secret plans that had nothing to do with her new marriage. But the most devastating photo wasn't of Sarah at all. It was of me. Jeremy had captured the moment during my speech when I looked out at the crowd, my face full of hope and love, completely unaware that half the guests were on their phones or talking among themselves. My son was checking his watch. My daughter was texting. Marcus was looking around the room like he wanted to be anywhere else. I was pouring my heart out to people who couldn't care less. The teacup slipped from my hands and shattered against my kitchen floor, the sound echoing through my apartment like a gunshot. I stared at the broken pieces, seeing my own reflection fractured in the ceramic shards. Tears I had been holding back for months finally came, silent and hot, streaming down my cheeks as the truth settled into my bones. I had been living a lie for years. My children didn't love me. They tolerated me. They used me. They saw me as nothing more than a bank account with legs, a convenient source of financial support and free labor who could be discarded the moment I became inconvenient. For the first time in my adult life, I allowed myself to think the unthinkable. What if I said no? What if I stopped giving? What if I demanded respect instead of begging for scraps of affection? The fear that followed that thought was overwhelming. If I stopped being useful, would I lose them completely? Was it better to be used than to be alone? I spent that night sitting on my kitchen floor, surrounded by broken china and even more broken dreams, staring at my reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back at me was tired, hollow, defeated, but somewhere in her eyes, I saw a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Anger. Not the explosive, destructive kind, but the slow-burning, righteous anger of someone who has finally recognized their own worth. As I swept up the broken teacup, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being invisible in my own life. Let me tell you about the years that led to that moment, because this story didn't begin with a USB drive full of painful truths. It began decades earlier, with a young woman who confused love with sacrifice and giving with living. I married my husband Robert when I was 22 years old. He was handsome and charming, with dark eyes and a smile that made me forget my own name. We had Sarah when I was 24 and David 2 years later. Those early years were filled with the chaos of young parenthood, sleepless nights, endless laundry, the sweet smell of baby powder, and the overwhelming joy of watching my children take their first steps and say their first words. Robert worked construction, and I stayed home with the babies. Money was tight, but we were happy. Or at least I thought we were happy. Looking back now, I can see the cracks that were already forming in our foundation. Robert's late nights that had nothing to do with work. The lipstick stains on his collar that he claimed came from his sister's goodbye kisses. The way he gradually stopped touching me, stopped looking at me like I was a woman instead of just a mother and housekeeper. But I pushed those doubts aside. I had children to raise and a household to manage. I threw myself into being the perfect wife and mother, believing that if I just gave more, loved harder, sacrificed deeper, everything would work out. When Sarah was 8 and David was 6, Robert's mother moved in with us. Maria Elena was 73 years old and suffering from the early stages of dementia. She needed constant care, help bathing, dressing, remembering to take her medications. Robert's siblings lived in other states and suddenly became very busy whenever the topic of mom's care came up. So it fell to me. For 6 years, I cared for Maria Elena while raising my children and keeping house for a husband who grew more distant by the day. I lifted her in and out of bed when her arthritis made movement painful. I cleaned up after the accidents that became more frequent as her condition worsened. I sat with her during the long, confusing nights when she couldn't remember where she was or who I was. I loved her, truly. She had been kind to me when Robert and I were first married, teaching me her family recipes and sharing stories about Robert's childhood. But caring for her while trying to be everything to everyone else nearly broke me. I lost 20 pounds that I couldn't afford to lose. My hair started falling out from stress. I developed an ulcer from worry and exhaustion. Robert never helped. He would come home from work, eat the dinner I had prepared, and disappear into the garage or the basement, claiming he needed time to decompress. Meanwhile, I was changing his mother's adult diapers and trying to help Sarah with her algebra homework while David practiced violin in the living room. The children began to resent the situation too. They were embarrassed to bring friends home because Grandma might have an episode. They complained that the house smelled like medicine and sadness. Sarah, in particular, became cruel in the way that only teenagers can be cruel. "Why can't she just go to a nursing home?" she would hiss at me when Maria Elena wandered into her room looking for the bathroom. This is gross, Mom. My friends think we're weird. I tried to explain that family takes care of family, that love means sacrifice, that someday when they were older, they would understand. But the words felt hollow, even as I spoke them. Maria Elena died on a Tuesday in March, quietly in her sleep. I found her when I brought her morning coffee, and for just a moment, I felt relief instead of grief. The relief frightened me more than anything else. What kind of person feels relieved when someone dies? The funeral was small. Robert's siblings flew in for 3 days, made their speeches about what a wonderful woman their mother had been, and disappeared again. I was left to clean out her room, to sort through her belongings, to decide what to keep and what to donate. Among her things, I found a letter she had written to Robert years earlier, before the dementia took hold of her memory. In it, she thanked him for marrying such a devoted woman. He wrote about how proud she was of the way I cared for everyone, how she worried that I gave too much of myself and didn't save enough for me. Take care of Rose, the letter said. She has such a good heart, but good hearts break easily when they're not protected. I cried reading those words, sitting alone in her empty room surrounded by boxes of her life. She had seen what I was too afraid to acknowledge, that I was disappearing a little more each day. But instead of heeding her warning, I threw myself even deeper into caring for others. Without Maria Elena to care for, I focused all my energy on my children. Sarah was 16 and beautiful, with my green eyes and Robert's dark hair. She had dreams of becoming a fashion designer and talked constantly about moving to Manhattan after graduation. I encouraged her dreams, even when they came with a price tag I couldn't afford. I paid for her art supplies, her special classes, her trips to museums and fashion shows. When she needed a dress for prom, I spent $400. We didn't have to make sure she looked perfect. When she wanted to take a summer course at the Fashion Institute of Technology, I picked up extra shifts at the nursing home where I had started working to pay for it. David was quieter, more studious. He played viola in the school orchestra and had a gift for mathematics. He was also shy and struggled to make friends, which broke my heart. I volunteered to drive for all his field trips, chaperoned school dances where he sat alone, and listened to him practice his instrument for hours because I knew how much it meant to him. I thought I was being a good mother. I thought love meant saying yes to everything, paying for everything, being available for everything. Robert and I grew further apart during these years. Our conversations became purely functional: schedules, bills, logistics. We slept in the same bed but felt like strangers. I told myself it was normal, that all marriages went through difficult periods, that things would get better once the children were older and we had more time for each other. I was lying to myself about so many things. The first crack in my carefully constructed denial came when Sarah was a senior in high school. She had been accepted to the Fashion Institute of Technology, her dream school, but the tuition was astronomical. Robert and I had exactly $3,000 in savings, and the first semester alone would cost $12,000. I suggested she take out student loans, start at a community college, work part-time to help with expenses. Sarah's response was cold and calculating in a way that shocked me. Mom, if you really loved me, you'd figure it out. Other parents do whatever it takes for their kids, but I guess you don't care about my future. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had never heard her speak to me with such contempt. But instead of recognizing the manipulation for what it was, I internalized the guilt. Maybe I wasn't doing enough. Maybe I was selfish for suggesting she help pay for her own education. I took out a second mortgage on our house. The monthly payments increased by $600, money we absolutely did not have. I picked up more shifts at work, sometimes pulling 16-hour days. My body ached constantly. I developed chronic migraines from the stress and lack of sleep. But Sarah was happy, and I told myself that's what mattered. Robert was furious when he found out about the second mortgage. We had our worst fight in years, screaming at each other in our kitchen while the children pretended not to hear from their bedrooms upstairs. "You're going to bankrupt us," he yelled. "You can't say no to anything. You're spoiling them rotten. They're our children," I screamed back. What kind of parents would we be if we didn't sacrifice for them? There's a difference between supporting your kids and letting them run your life, he said, his voice dropping to that cold, controlled tone that always frightened me more than yelling. But you never learned that difference, did you? He was right, but I couldn't admit it. Admitting it would mean acknowledging that my entire identity as a mother was built on a foundation of fear. Fear that if I wasn't useful, I would be unloved. Sarah graduated and moved to Manhattan. She called home twice a month, usually when she needed money. Her requests were always urgent: rent money, textbook fees, money for supplies, money for networking events. Each time I found a way to send what she asked for, even if it meant skipping my own doctor's appointments or buying generic groceries to stretch our budget. David went to college too, on a partial scholarship to study engineering. He was quieter about his needs, but still dependent. I sent him care packages twice a month, paid for his textbooks, covered his dorm fees when his scholarship didn't stretch far enough. I was proud of my children. They were successful, educated, pursuing their dreams. But I was bankrupting myself to make those dreams possible, and they seemed to expect it as their due. The phone calls became less frequent as they settled into their adult lives. Sarah landed a job at a small fashion house in Brooklyn, though it barely paid enough to cover her rent. David graduated and found work with an engineering firm in New Jersey. Both of them were technically adults, living their own lives, but still calling mom whenever they needed financial rescue. And I kept saying yes. When Sarah needed first and last month's rent for a new apartment, I sent $3,000 from our dwindling savings. When David's car broke down and he needed a replacement, I co-signed for a loan and made the payments when his budget was too tight. When Sarah decided she wanted to start her own fashion line and needed startup capital, I liquidated my retirement account. $23,000 gone in a single transaction. Robert left me 2 months later. He didn't make a big dramatic exit. He simply came home from work one Tuesday, packed 2 suitcases, and told me he couldn't watch me destroy yourself anymore. "I've tried to talk to you for years," he said, standing in our living room with his suitcase in his hand. "But you won't listen. You think that giving everything away makes you a saint, but it just makes you a victim. And I can't be married to a victim anymore." His words cut deep, because somewhere inside, I knew he was right. But by then, I was so far down the rabbit hole of martyrdom that I couldn't see a way out. The children needed me. Who would I be if I wasn't needed? "Where will you go?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. "My brother's place in New Jersey. The divorce papers will be ready next week." And just like that, my marriage of 28 years was over. The children's reactions to the divorce were telling. Sarah was angry with me for driving Dad away. David barely acknowledged it at all, as if their parents' marriage had been so irrelevant to his life that its end was just another piece of paperwork to file away. Neither of them offered emotional support. Neither of them asked how I was doing or if I needed anything. They were too busy with their own lives to notice that mine was falling apart. I moved out of the house we had shared for decades. Robert kept it in the divorce settlement, and into the small apartment in Astoria where I still live today. The rent was cheaper than our old mortgage, but I was now living on a single income and supporting 2 adult children who still saw me as an unlimited source of financial assistance. The requests never stopped. If anything, they increased after the divorce. Sarah's fashion line was struggling, so she needed money for rent. David wanted to go back to graduate school, so he needed tuition assistance. Both of them had learned to frame their requests as emotional manipulation. "Mom, if you can't help me, I don't know what I'm going to do," became Sarah's favorite phrase. It worked every time. I picked up more work, taking on private duty nursing cases that required me to work overnight shifts. I slept during the day and worked all night, caring for elderly patients whose families had abandoned them to strangers' care. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I was too exhausted to dwell on it. My health began to deteriorate. Chronic fatigue, high blood pressure, depression that I refused to acknowledge or treat. I gained weight from eating too much fast food and not getting enough sleep. My hair turned completely gray, and I stopped bothering to diet. I wore the same 5 outfits over and over again because buying new clothes seemed like a frivolous expense when my children needed money. I became invisible, even to myself. The years blurred together in a haze of work and worry and constant financial stress. Sarah's phone calls became more infrequent but no less expensive. She was dating someone new every few months. Men who seemed to require costly dinners and gifts that somehow became my responsibility. David was steadier but equally entitled, treating my financial support as a given rather than a gift. When I was 68, I had a mild heart attack. I was working a night shift at a private residence, caring for a 90-year-old woman with Alzheimer's, when the chest pains started. Sharp, stabbing pains that radiated down my left arm and made it difficult to breathe. I called 911 and spent 3 days in the hospital while doctors ran tests and adjusted medications. I called both of my children from the hospital. Sarah's phone went straight to voicemail, and she didn't return my call for 2 days. When she finally called back, she was irritated. "Mom, you scared me with that message. You said you were in the hospital, but you're obviously fine if you're calling me back." I explained about the heart attack, about the new medications, about the doctor's warnings that I needed to reduce stress and work fewer hours. "Well, that's good then," she said, already distracted. "You've been working too much anyway. Listen, I have to go, but I'm glad you're okay." She hung up before I could tell her I was scared. Before I could tell her I felt alone and fragile and desperately in need of someone to care about me the way I had cared about everyone else for so many decades. David's response was slightly better, but not by much. He visited me in the hospital once, staying for about 20 minutes before claiming he had to get back to work. He brought flowers from the hospital gift shop and awkwardly patted my hand while avoiding eye contact. "You should take better care of yourself, Mom," he said, as if my heart attack was a personal failing rather than the predictable result of decades of chronic stress. Neither of them offered to help with my medical bills or asked if I needed assistance during my recovery. Sarah actually called 3 days after I got home from the hospital to ask if I could loan her money for a security deposit on a new apartment. "I know the timing isn't great," she said, "but the apartment is perfect, and if I don't move quickly, someone else will get it." I said yes. I always said yes. Even as I was recovering from a heart attack, struggling to climb the stairs to my apartment, managing new medications and dietary restrictions, I sent my daughter $2,000 for an apartment I would never be invited to see. That was my breaking point, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Something shifted inside me during those quiet weeks at home, recovering from the heart attack. Maybe it was the forced solitude that gave me time to think. Maybe it was the stark reality of my own mortality. Maybe it was simply exhaustion from carrying everyone else's burdens for so long. I started noticing things I had been too busy to see before, like the fact that neither of my children ever called just to check on me. Every phone call had an agenda, usually financial. Like the fact that I couldn't remember the last time either of them had asked about my life, my health, my happiness, my dreams. I realized I didn't even know what my dreams were anymore. I had been so focused on enabling everyone else's dreams that I had forgotten I was allowed to have my own. Slowly, tentatively, I started saying no to small things. When Sarah called asking for money for a weekend trip to the Hamptons with her new boyfriend, I said I couldn't afford it. When David wanted me to drive to New Jersey to help him move apartments, I claimed I was too tired. These tiny acts of self-preservation felt monumental to me, like learning to walk again after a long illness. The children's reactions to these minor rebellions were swift and telling. Sarah became manipulative, crying on the phone about how stressful her life was and how much she needed my support. David became cold and distant, treating my no answers as personal attacks rather than reasonable boundaries. Their responses confirmed what I was beginning to understand. My value to them was purely transactional. I was loved for what I provided, not for who I was. This realization should have been devastating, but instead, it was oddly liberating. For the first time in my adult life, I saw my relationships clearly, without the distorting lens of desperate hope and unconditional giving. But I still wasn't strong enough to make real changes. Not yet. That strength would come later, in the form of a USB drive full of wedding photos that would show me exactly how little I meant to the people I had sacrificed everything to love. But first, let me tell you about Sarah's engagement. She called me on a Tuesday evening in January, breathless with excitement. She had met someone new, someone wonderful, someone who understood her creative spirit and supported her ambitions. His name was Marcus, and he worked in finance. They had been dating for 6 months, and he had proposed with a ring that cost more than I made in 3 months. "Mom, he's perfect," she gushed over the phone. "He's successful and stable, and he actually listens when I talk about my designs. We want to get married this summer, and we want you to be there." The wedding planning began immediately, and from the beginning, it was clear that this was going to be an expensive affair. Sarah had always dreamed of a fairy tale wedding, and Marcus seemed happy to indulge her fantasies, to a point. "We're thinking somewhere intimate but elegant," Sarah explained during one of our early planning phone calls. "Maybe 100 guests. Nothing too crazy, but definitely somewhere special." The venue she had chosen was a historic mansion in Westchester County that charged $15,000 just for venue rental. The catering would be another $20,000. Photography, flowers, music, decorations. The list of expenses seemed endless, and the total quickly climbed towards $60,000. Marcus's parents were contributing $20,000. Sarah and Marcus together had saved about $15,000. That left a gap of $25,000, and Sarah looked at me with expectant eyes. "Mom, I know it's a lot, but this is my wedding day. It's the most important day of my life. I can't have some cheap, tacky ceremony. What would people think?" What would people think? Not how would this make me feel, or was this something I could afford, or would this financial burden cause me hardship? What would people think? I should have said no. My heart attack had been barely 2 years earlier. My savings were already decimated. I was living on a fixed income and working extra shifts just to pay for my medications and basic living expenses. But she was my daughter, and it was her wedding day. I took out a loan against my life insurance policy and gave her $25,000. The months leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of details that always seemed to require more money. Sarah needed a dress. Not just any dress, but the perfect dress, which cost $1,000 more than originally budgeted. She needed alterations, another $800. She decided she wanted a different photographer at the last minute, another $2,000. Each request came with emotional blackmail wrapped in excitement. Mom, this is so important to me. I know you understand how much this means to me. You're the only one who's always been there for me. I wrote check after check, each one shrinking my already precarious financial foundation. The rehearsal dinner was my responsibility, according to tradition. Sarah chose a restaurant in Manhattan that specialized in organic, farm-to-table cuisine. For 35 people, the bill was $4,500. I paid it with a credit card because I no longer had that much cash available. Through all of this, David remained largely absent from the wedding planning process. He was included as a groomsman, but he seemed to view the entire affair with the same detached tolerance he had shown toward most family events since college. He would attend because social convention required it, but he wasn't emotionally invested in the process. Marcus seemed like a nice enough young man, though something about him made me vaguely uncomfortable. He was polite to me, but formal, treating me like a service provider rather than a potential family member. He never asked about my life or showed interest in getting to know me as a person. Our conversations were limited to wedding logistics and pleasantries about the weather. His family was wealthy, old money from Connecticut with a summer house in Martha's Vineyard and connections to social circles I had never imagined. His mother, Carol, was a thin, elegant woman who spoke in the kind of cultivated accent that suggested boarding schools and country clubs. She was never outright rude to me, but she had a way of looking through me as if I were part of the venue's decor rather than the bride's mother. The closer we got to the wedding date, the more anxious I became. I had spent my entire life savings and then some on this event, but I felt increasingly peripheral to the actual celebration. Sarah was busy with her own preparations and rarely included me in decisions. When I offered opinions or suggestions, they were politely dismissed or ignored entirely. I bought a dress for the wedding, a modest navy blue outfit that cost more than I had spent on clothing in the previous 2 years combined. I had my hair styled at a salon for the first time in decades. I wanted to look nice for my daughter's special day, even though I suspected I would be largely invisible in the sea of Marcus's sophisticated relatives and Sarah's glamorous friends. The day of the wedding arrived with humid August weather that made my new dress stick to my skin, and my carefully styled hair wilt within an hour. The venue was beautiful, a sprawling estate with manicured gardens and a mansion that looked like something from a movie. Guests milled around the grounds, sipping cocktails and making conversation while a string quartet played in the background. I stood near the gift table, watching Sarah pose for pre-ceremony photos with her bridesmaids. She looked radiant in her $1,000 dress, her makeup professionally applied, her smile brilliant and confident. This was her moment, the fairy tale wedding she had dreamed of since childhood. But as I watched her laugh with her friends, I realized I felt like a spectator at my own daughter's wedding. I had paid for this day, but I didn't belong at it. I was the hired help who had been invited to stay for the dinner. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Sarah and Marcus exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to support each other's dreams and build a life full of adventure and love. My daughter looked happy in a way I had rarely seen, and for a moment all the financial sacrifice felt worthwhile. But even during the ceremony, I noticed small signs of my exile from the family narrative. I was seated in the third row instead of the front, behind Marcus's grandparents and various relatives I didn't recognize. David sat next to me but spent most of the ceremony checking his phone. When the photographer asked for family photos after the ceremony, I was included reluctantly and positioned at the edge of every group shot. The reception was held in the mansion's ballroom, with round tables decorated with centerpieces that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I was seated at a table with distant relatives and family friends, people who knew me peripherally but had no particular interest in conversation. Sarah and Marcus made their rounds to each table during dinner, thanking guests for coming, but they spent maybe 2 minutes at my table before moving on to more important guests. During dinner, I attempted to make conversation with the other guests at my table. Marcus's aunt from Boston chatted politely about the weather and the venue. Sarah's college roommate made small talk about life in the city, but I could feel their disinterest, their desire to be anywhere else but trapped at the family table with the bride's aging mother. It was during the toasts that everything began to unravel for me emotionally. Marcus's best man gave a funny, heartfelt speech about their friendship since college. Sarah's maid of honor told charming stories about their adventures as roommates after graduation. Marcus's father offered a toast, welcoming Sarah to their family and speaking about the bright future ahead of the young couple. And then it was my turn. I had prepared my speech carefully, writing and rewriting it for weeks. I wanted to strike the right tone. Sentimental but not maudlin, personal but not embarrassing, heartfelt but not overwhelming. I had practiced it in my apartment, timing it to be about 3 minutes long. I stood up at my assigned moment, my hands shaking slightly as I held my champagne glass and looked out at the crowd of expectant faces. Sarah smiled at me encouragingly, but something in her expression seemed forced, as if she were bracing herself for potential embarrassment. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice wavering slightly. "For those who don't know me, I'm Rose, Sarah's mother." I paused, waiting for some acknowledgement from the crowd, but the room remained politely quiet. Someone in the back was still talking, and I could see several guests checking their phones. "I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate this special day with Sarah and Marcus. Watching my daughter find love and happiness means everything to me." I looked at Sarah, hoping to see some warmth in her expression, but she was looking past me toward the head table where Marcus was sitting. "Sarah has always been special," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "Even as a little girl, she had such creativity, such determination. I remember when she was 8 years old, she designed an entire wardrobe for her Barbie dolls out of fabric scraps, complete with tiny handbags made from twist ties and aluminum foil." A few people chuckled politely, but I could sense the room's impatience. This wasn't the kind of sophisticated toast they were expecting. As her mother, I've watched her grow into an incredible woman. Her strength, her artistic vision, her capacity for love, these are gifts that will serve her well in marriage. And Marcus, you're getting someone truly special. Someone who will challenge you and inspire you and love you with everything she has. I paused again, emotion catching in my throat. This was the moment I had planned to talk about sacrifice and love, about the joy of watching your child find happiness, about the bittersweet nature of letting go. But as I looked out at the crowd, I saw David checking his watch. I saw Sarah's friends whispering to each other. I saw Marcus's relatives looking at me with barely concealed impatience. "I just want to say how proud I am," I said, cutting my speech short, "and how much I love you both. Congratulations." I raised my glass and sat down quickly, my heart pounding with embarrassment and hurt. The applause was polite but brief, and conversation immediately resumed as if nothing had happened. That should have been my first clue about how the rest of the evening would unfold. The dancing began after dinner, and I watched from my table as Sarah and Marcus shared their first dance as husband and wife. They looked beautiful together, lost in their own world of happiness and new love. Other couples joined them on the dance floor, and eventually the party moved into full swing with music that was too loud for conversation and too contemporary for my taste. I tried to remain part of the celebration, but I felt increasingly like a ghost haunting someone else's party. Young people clustered together, laughing and dancing and taking selfies. Older guests found each other and made their own conversation circles. But I didn't fit into any group. I was too old for the young crowd and too unfamiliar to the older guests. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to leave. Sarah was busy dancing with her college friends, and I didn't want to interrupt her happiness with a goodbye that might feel like an obligation. I collected my purse from my table and made my way toward the exit. I was walking through the foyer when Marcus's mother, Carol, intercepted me. "Rose, leaving so early?" she asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly concerned about my departure. "It's been a long day," I said, trying to keep my voice light, "and I'm not much of a night owl anymore." "Well, thank you for everything you did to make today special," she said, her words polite but hollow. "I know Sarah appreciates all your help." Help. That's what I was to her. The help. "It was my pleasure," I replied, though the words tasted bitter. "She's my daughter." "Of course. Well, drive safely." And that was it. No invitation to stay in touch. No suggestion that we might become friends now that our children were married. No acknowledgement that we were now connected by more than tonight's event. I walked to my car alone, my feet aching in my new shoes, the sound of music and laughter fading behind me. As I drove back to Queens through the late-night traffic, I replayed the evening in my mind, trying to understand why I felt so hollow instead of happy. My daughter had married a good man. The wedding had been beautiful. Everything had gone according to plan. So why did I feel like I had just attended a stranger's event rather than the most important day of my child's life? I arrived at my apartment after midnight, exhausted and emotionally drained. I hung up my expensive dress and washed off my professional makeup, staring at myself in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at me was tired and sad, aged beyond my years by stress and disappointment. I had spent $23,000 I couldn't afford to give my daughter the wedding of her dreams. I had hosted a rehearsal dinner for people who barely acknowledged my existence. I had delivered a speech to a room full of people who couldn't wait for me to stop talking. And for what? I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table, still wearing the slip I had worn under my dress, too tired to change into my nightgown. The apartment felt smaller and lonelier than ever after the grandeur of the wedding venue. The silence was oppressive after hours of music and conversation. That's when I allowed myself to admit the truth I had been avoiding all evening. I had felt more alone at my daughter's wedding than I did sitting by myself in my empty apartment. The next morning brought the hollow ache I mentioned at the beginning of this story. I woke up with a headache from too much wine and not enough sleep, my body stiff from sitting in uncomfortable chairs and forcing smiles for hours. I made coffee and sat in my kitchen, waiting for phone calls that didn't come. I expected Sarah to call thanking me again, maybe sharing some final details about the evening I had missed. I expected David to check in and ask how I was feeling after the long day. I expected someone to acknowledge that I had been part of something important. But my phone remained silent. The silence stretched through the morning and into the afternoon. I tried to keep busy, doing laundry and cleaning my apartment, but my thoughts kept returning to the wedding. I found myself replaying conversations and analyzing interactions, searching for signs that I had mattered more than I felt. That's when the knock came at my door, and everything changed. The wedding photographer's assistant stood in my hallway, holding that manila envelope that would shatter whatever illusions I still clung to about my relationship with my children. Inside was the USB drive that contained more than photographs. It contained evidence of a truth I had been too hopeful to see. I've already told you about some of those photos. About the images of Sarah with another man. About the candid shots that revealed my family's true feelings toward me. But I haven't told you about the most devastating discovery of all. Among the photos was a series taken during the cocktail hour before the ceremony began. Sarah was standing with her bridesmaids in a small group near the bar, and the photographer had captured their conversation with his telephoto lens. In the photos, I could see Sarah's face clearly as she spoke to her friends. She was gesturing toward where I stood near the gift table, and her expression was one of irritation and embarrassment. One of her bridesmaids was laughing, covering her mouth with her hand in theatrical shock. Another was shaking her head sympathetically. I couldn't hear their words, but their body language told the story clearly enough. My daughter was complaining about me to her friends at her own wedding. I was the embarrassing relative, the burden she had to tolerate for appearance's sake. But the photo that broke my heart completely was one taken during my toast. While I had been speaking about my love for Sarah, about my pride in the woman she had become, the photographer had captured the crowd's reaction. David was indeed checking his watch, but he was also rolling his eyes. Sarah's friends were exchanging glances that clearly said, "When will this be over?" Marcus's relatives looked bored or irritated, and Sarah herself was texting on her phone, hidden behind her bouquet, while I poured my heart out to a room that couldn't wait for me to stop talking. That image hit me like a physical blow. I had spent weeks preparing that speech, wanting to find the perfect words to express my love and pride. I had practiced it until I could deliver it without notes, timing every pause and inflection. It was my moment to publicly acknowledge the joy of being Sarah's mother, to share her accomplishments with the people who mattered to her. And she had been texting while I spoke. I sat at my kitchen table for hours, clicking through photo after photo, forcing myself to see the truth I had been avoiding for years. In every family group shot, I was positioned at the edge, easily cropped out if necessary. In every candid moment, I was isolated, standing alone while others clustered together in conversation. The photos told a story about a wedding where the bride's mother had paid for everything but belonged to nothing. But the pictures of Sarah with the mystery man haunted me most. This wasn't a casual conversation between acquaintances. This was intimate, secretive, loaded with history and future plans. Sarah had gotten married that afternoon, but she was already making arrangements with someone else. Who was he? How long had they known each other? And what did those bank statements on her phone have to do with their relationship? I realized I didn't really know my daughter at all. I knew the version of herself she presented to me when she needed something. The struggling artist, the devoted daughter, the grateful recipient of my endless generosity. But the real Sarah, the woman who made plans with mysterious men at her own wedding, was a stranger to me. That realization was more painful than the financial exploitation or the social exclusion. I had given everything to someone I didn't actually know, someone who had been performing the role of loving daughter for my benefit while living an entirely different life behind the scenes. The next few days passed in a blur of hurt and confusion. I kept expecting Sarah or David to call, but as the silence stretched on, I realized they probably wouldn't. The wedding was over. I had served my purpose. Until they needed something else from me, I would remain invisible. 4 days after the wedding, Sarah finally called. I was so desperate to hear from her that I answered on the first ring. "Mom, hi," she said, her voice bright with false enthusiasm. "Sorry I haven't called sooner. The honeymoon planning has been crazy, and Marcus and I have been so busy with thank you cards and getting settled." "How was the wedding night?" I asked, though the question felt hollow given what I had seen in the photographs. "Oh, perfect. Just perfect. Everyone said it was the most beautiful wedding they'd ever been to. And your toast was so sweet, Mom. Really heartfelt." Sweet. Heartfelt. The kind of empty compliments you give to someone whose feelings you want to manage rather than engage with, honestly. I'm glad you enjoyed it, I said, testing to see if she would notice the flatness in my voice. Listen, Mom. I wanted to call because Marcus and I have been talking about the honeymoon, and we realized we're a little short on spending money. You know how expensive everything is in Europe. I was wondering if you could maybe help us out with just a little extra cash. Nothing major, maybe $2,000 or $3,000. $2,000 or $3,000 for spending money. For the honeymoon following the wedding I had already paid for. Sarah, I said slowly, I've already given you $25,000 for the wedding, plus the rehearsal dinner. I don't have any more money to give you. There was silence on the other end of the line, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice had changed completely. Mom, this is our honeymoon. This is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I thought you'd want us to have the best possible time. I do want you to be happy, I said, surprised by my own calmness. But I literally don't have the money. I took out loans to pay for your wedding. I'm already in debt. Well, then maybe you could figure something out? Take out another loan or something? I mean, this is important, Mom. The casual cruelty of her suggestion took my breath away. She wanted me to go deeper into debt for her honeymoon spending money, as if my financial well-being was irrelevant compared to her comfort. For the first time in my adult life, I said the word I should have learned decades earlier. No. What? No, Sarah, I can't. I won't. You're a married adult now, and you need to figure out your own finances. The silence that followed was loaded with shock and anger. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was cold in a way that reminded me of her father during our worst fights. I can't believe you're being so selfish about this. After everything I've given you over the years, after making you part of my special day, this is how you repay me? By refusing to help when I really need you? Everything she had given me? Making me part of her special day? The manipulation was so brazen it was almost impressive. Sarah, what exactly have you given me over the years? I asked, my voice still calm but with an edge that I had never allowed before. My love, Mom, my friendship, including you in my life. Most kids my age barely talk to their parents, but I've always made sure to stay close to you. And now you're going to throw that away over a few $1,000s? My love, my friendship, including you in my life, as if those were gifts she had bestowed on me rather than the natural bond between mother and child. As if maintaining a relationship with me was a favor she had done rather than a mutual connection built over decades of history. I need to go, I said, my voice starting to shake with anger. Mom, don't hang up. Let's talk about this reasonably. I'm sure we can work something out. There's nothing to work out. You're married now, Sarah. You're an adult. It's time to act like one. I hung up before she could respond, my hands trembling as I set down the phone. I had never spoken to my daughter that way before. I had never refused her anything she truly wanted. I had never drawn a line that she couldn't cross. It felt terrifying and liberating at the same time. Within an hour, my phone was ringing again. This time it was David, which surprised me. He rarely initiated calls unless he needed something specific. Mom, I just got off the phone with Sarah. She's really upset. Of course she had called David. She was probably calling everyone she could think of to build a case against me, to frame my refusal as unreasonable and cruel. I'm sure she is, I said. She said you refused to help with the honeymoon. That doesn't sound like you. It didn't sound like me. For 48 years, I had been the person who said yes to everything, who sacrificed her own needs for everyone else's comfort, who bought love with money and exhaustion. Maybe you don't know me as well as you think you do, I said. Look, Mom, I don't want to get in the middle of this, but Sarah's right. You've always been there for us when we needed you. Why are you choosing now to be difficult? Difficult. That's what standing up for myself had become in their eyes. Being difficult. David, when was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? What does that have to do with anything? When was the last time either of you asked about my health, my finances, my happiness? When was the last time you cared about my well-being instead of what I could do for you? That's not fair, Mom. We care about you. But this is about Sarah's honeymoon. No, I said, my voice getting stronger. This is about respect, and I'm tired of not getting any. I hung up on him too. The house felt different that night. Quieter, but not in the oppressive way I was used to. This was a productive quiet, the kind that comes when you stop filling silence with desperate attempts to please people who don't appreciate your efforts. But the peace didn't last long. The next morning brought a series of text messages from both children that revealed just how much they had taken my compliance for granted. From Sarah, Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I realize you're probably just stressed about money. I understand that. But Marcus and I have found a solution. We can take a smaller honeymoon now, and you can help us plan a bigger trip for our first anniversary. That way you have time to save up and we still get our special vacation. See? Problem solved. From David. Mom, Sarah told me more about the situation. I think you're being a little unreasonable, but I get that you're worried about finances. Here's an idea. What if I co-sign for a loan to help Sarah and Marcus? That way you're not technically taking on more debt yourself, but you can still help family. Let me know what you think. Both messages treated my no as a temporary obstacle to be worked around rather than a legitimate boundary to be respected. Neither child had considered the possibility that I might have meant what I said, that I might be serious about changing the dynamic of our relationship. I didn't respond to either text. By evening, my phone was ringing with calls from Sarah that I didn't answer. She left voicemails that grew increasingly frantic and manipulative. Mom, I don't understand what's gotten into you. This isn't like you at all. Are you having some kind of health problems? Maybe you should see a doctor. Call me back, please. Mom, Marcus and I are really worried about you. You're acting so strange. If you're going through some kind of mental health crisis, we can help you find resources. But you can't just cut off your family like this. Mom, fine. If you don't want to help with the honeymoon, whatever. But at least call me back so I know you're okay. This silent treatment is really hurtful and immature. Mental health crisis. Immature. Strange behavior? My refusal to be financially exploited had been reframed as evidence that something was wrong with me, rather than recognition that something was wrong with our relationship. On the third night after our fight, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. I turned off my phone and went to bed early, sleeping more soundly than I had in months. The next morning, I drove to a bank in Manhattan and met with a financial advisor about my debt situation. I learned just how precarious my position had become. The loans against my life insurance policy, the credit card debt from the rehearsal dinner, the second mortgage I had taken out years earlier for Sarah's college tuition. I was drowning, and my children were asking me to take on more water. Mrs. Martinez, the advisor said gently, you need to stop lending money immediately. Any additional debt could put your housing at risk. You're 3 months away from not being able to make your rent if your expenses continue at this level. 3 months. I was 3 months away from homelessness, and my daughter wanted spending money for her European honeymoon. That afternoon, I called a legal aid clinic in Queens that specialized in elder law. I needed to understand my rights, my options, and how to protect what little I had left from further depletion. The lawyer I met with was a kind woman named Patricia, who reminded me of my younger self, tired but determined, fighting against systems that seemed designed to exploit vulnerable people. Your situation is more common than you might think, she told me. Adult children who see their aging parents as a source of financial support rather than people deserving respect and care. The good news is that you still have options. The bad news is that exercising those options will probably be emotionally painful. She helped me understand which debts were secured and which were unsecured, how to protect my apartment from creditors, and what legal steps I could take to prevent future financial abuse. The most important thing, she said, is to stop giving them money immediately. I know that's hard when they're your children, but you can't set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. You can't set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. That phrase stuck with me as I rode the subway back to Queens. I had been setting myself on fire for decades, slowly burning away my health, my finances, my sense of self, all to provide warmth for people who never even noticed I was turning to ash. But fires can be put out. And from the ashes, sometimes something stronger grows back. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art by myself. I took the subway into Manhattan, paid the suggested admission fee, and spent hours wandering through galleries full of beautiful things created by people who had poured their souls into their work. I stood in front of paintings that had survived for centuries, outlasting the artists who created them and the patrons who commissioned them. I thought about legacy and purpose and what it means to create something meaningful with your life. In my purse, I carried a small notebook where I wrote down thoughts and observations, something I hadn't done since high school. The act of putting pen to paper, of capturing my own thoughts and reactions, felt revolutionary after decades of only expressing myself in service to others. By the time I returned to Queens that evening, something had fundamentally shifted inside me. I was still hurt and angry about Sarah and David's behavior, but I was no longer devastated by it. Their rejection stung, but it no longer felt like a death sentence. I was discovering that I could exist without their approval. Monday morning brought another phone call from Sarah, but this time her tone had changed completely. Mom, I've been talking to Marcus and some friends about our situation, and I think there's been a misunderstanding. I never meant to sound demanding about the honeymoon money. I was just excited and maybe didn't express myself well. This was a new strategy. reframing her demands as miscommunication rather than acknowledging the fundamental problem in our relationship. We've decided to take a smaller honeymoon after all, she continued. Maybe just a long weekend in the Hamptons instead of Europe, so you don't need to worry about the money thing anymore. The money thing? As if my financial exhaustion was a minor inconvenience rather than the result of decades of exploitation. That's good, I said, neutral, non-committal. And I was thinking maybe we could all get together for dinner this weekend. You, me, Marcus, and David. Just family, you know? We haven't done that in a while. Just family. The implication being that we were all equally responsible for the distance that had grown between us, that this was a mutual problem requiring a mutual solution. I don't think so, I said. What? Why not? Because I don't think you understand what the real problem is, Sarah. And until you do, getting together for dinner isn't going to solve anything. Then explain it to me, Mom. Tell me what I'm not understanding. This was the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for my entire adult life. The conversation where I finally told the truth instead of managing everyone else's comfort. The problem isn't the honeymoon money, I said. The problem is that you only call me when you need something. The problem is that you treat me like a service provider rather than a person. The problem is that I've been working myself to death to pay for your dreams while you've never once asked about mine. That's not true, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. When was the last time you asked how I'm doing financially? When was the last time you asked about my health? I continued. When was the last time you called just to talk, without needing money or help or some problem solved? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if she had hung up. Mom, she finally said, and for the first time in years, she sounded like the little girl she used to be. I didn't realize. I always just assumed you were fine. You never said you were struggling. I shouldn't have to beg for your attention and care, Sarah. I'm your mother, not your employee. I know that. Of course I know that. But you've always been so strong, so capable. You've always handled everything. I guess I never thought about what it cost you. This was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I had ever received from either of my children, but it wasn't enough. Recognizing a problem isn't the same as taking responsibility for it or committing to change. What do you want me to do? She asked, and I could hear tears in her voice. I want you to think about who you are when you're not asking me for something, I said. I want you to consider whether you actually know me as a person or just as a source of support. And I want you to decide whether you're interested in having a real relationship with me or just maintaining a transactional one. Of course I want a real relationship, she said quickly. Then prove it. Don't call me asking for anything for 6 months. Call me because you want to know how I'm doing. Call me because you miss me. Call me because you have something interesting to share. But don't call me because you need money or help or solutions to your problems. 6 months? Mom, that's a long time. It's not long at all if you actually want a relationship with me instead of just access to my resources. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling simultaneously exhausted and energized. I had said things I had needed to say for decades, drawn boundaries I had needed to draw since my children were teenagers. It felt terrifying and necessary and long overdue, but the hardest part was yet to come. 3 days later, David called. His approach was different from Sarah's. More analytical, less emotional, but equally manipulative in its own way. Mom, I think Sarah is really trying to understand your perspective, he began. But this whole situation has gotten pretty dramatic. Maybe it's time to dial things back and find a middle ground. Dial things back, find a middle ground. What kind of middle ground were you thinking of? I asked. Well, you made your point about boundaries and respect. Sarah gets that now. But completely cutting off communication seems extreme. Maybe you could agree to some kind of regular check-in schedule so she knows you care, and in return, she'll be more conscious about not always asking for help. David had always been the family mediator, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found compromises. But his proposal revealed that he, like Sarah, still didn't understand the fundamental problem. David, I said, do you ever think about me when you're not talking to me? What do you mean? I mean, when you're living your life, going to work, spending time with friends, making decisions about your future, do you ever wonder how I'm doing? Do you ever think, I should call my mom just to see how she is? Do you ever miss me? The silence that followed was answer enough. I think about you, he said eventually, but even he didn't sound convinced. When was the last time you called me without needing something? I asked. We talk pretty regularly. We talk when you or Sarah need something from me. That's not the same thing. Look, Mom, I think you're overthinking this. Parents help their kids. That's how families work. It doesn't mean we don't love you. Parents help their kids. That simple statement encapsulated everything wrong with our relationship. In David's mind, the flow of support went in only one direction. from parent to child, regardless of the child's age or the parent's capacity to give. David, I'm 68 years old. I had a heart attack 2 years ago. I'm living paycheck to paycheck because I've spent my life savings on your sister's education and wedding. At what point do I stop being just a parent and start being a person who deserves care and consideration? You are a person, Mom. Of course you are. But you can't expect us to suddenly change the way our family has always worked just because you're going through a rough patch. A rough patch. As if decades of financial and emotional exhaustion were a temporary inconvenience rather than the predictable result of a dysfunctional dynamic. This is exactly what I'm talking about, I said, my voice rising for the first time in the conversation. You see my refusal to continue sacrificing myself as a character flaw rather than a healthy boundary. You see my exhaustion as a rough patch rather than a consequence of your choices. I don't think this conversation is productive anymore, David said, his voice cooling into the professional tone he used when he wanted to end uncomfortable discussions. You're probably right, I agreed. Call me when you want to get to know me as a person, rather than manage me as a problem. I hung up and immediately turned off my phone. I couldn't handle any more calls, any more attempts to negotiate my return to the role of self-sacrificing mother who asked for nothing and gave everything. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and made a list of things I wanted to do for myself. Small things, mostly. Visit museums, take a cooking class, read books I had been meaning to get to for years. But also bigger things. Maybe travel somewhere I had always wanted to see. Maybe take a creative writing course. Maybe volunteer for a cause I cared about. For the first time in my adult life, I was making plans that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or desires. The next few weeks passed quietly. My phone stayed mostly silent, which was both painful and peaceful. I missed my children, but I didn't miss the constant anxiety of waiting for their next crisis or financial emergency. I started volunteering at a literacy program in Queens, helping adult immigrants learn to read English. The work was rewarding in a way that shocked me. These students were grateful for my time and attention, but they didn't take it for granted. They saw me as a person with valuable skills and knowledge, not just a resource to be extracted from. I also started attending a support group for people dealing with financial abuse by family members. The meetings were held at a community center in Flushing, and I was surprised to discover how many older adults were dealing with similar situations. There was Margaret, whose son had stolen her credit cards to fund his gambling addiction. There was Frank, whose daughter had convinced him to put her name on his bank accounts and then clean them out to pay for her boyfriend's legal troubles. There was Elena, whose grandchildren had been trained by their parents to guilt her into constant gifts and loans. Listening to their stories made me realize that my situation, while painful, was far from unique. There was even a name for what I had been experiencing: elder financial abuse. It didn't matter that the abusers were my own children. Their behavior fit a recognizable pattern of exploitation that social workers and counselors dealt with regularly. The support group taught me practical strategies for protecting myself financially, but more importantly, it helped me understand that I wasn't crazy or selfish for wanting to be treated with respect. My children's behavior wasn't normal family dynamics. It was a form of abuse that I had been conditioned to accept as love. 6 weeks after our last conversation, Sarah called. I stared at her name on my phone screen for several rings before deciding to answer. Hi, Sarah. Mom, how are you? Her voice was tentative, careful. I'm fine. How are things with you? Good. Well, okay. The honeymoon was nice. We ended up going to Cape Cod instead of the Hamptons. It was actually really relaxing. We made small talk for a few minutes. Neutral topics that felt foreign after years of crisis-driven conversations. She told me about her work at the fashion house, about Marcus's job in finance, about their new apartment in Brooklyn. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, she told me eventually, about calling just to talk instead of always needing something. And you were right. I realized that I don't really know what's going on in your life. Like, I don't know what you do for fun, or what you worry about, or what makes you happy. I know you work as a home health aide, but I don't know if you like it or if it's just what pays the bills. This was more self-awareness than Sarah had ever demonstrated before, but I remained cautious. Recognizing a problem was only the first step toward actually addressing it. What else have you been thinking about? I asked. I've been thinking about how I never ask about your health, even though you had a heart attack. I've been thinking about how I always assumed you were handling everything fine because that's what you've always done. And I've been thinking about how selfish that probably seemed to you. How did it seem to me? Like I didn't care about you as a person. Like I only cared about what you could do for me. It was a start. But sentiment without action was just another form of manipulation, even if it wasn't consciously intended that way. So what are you going to do differently? I asked. I want to take you out to dinner, she said. Somewhere nice, my treat. And I want to ask you about your life and actually listen to the answers. And I want to tell you about mine in a way that's about sharing, not about needing help or advice. It was a reasonable proposal, but I found myself hesitating. Part of me desperately wanted to say yes, to grasp at this offering of genuine connection, but a larger part of me remained skeptical. One dinner didn't erase decades of exploitation, and I wasn't ready to trust that Sarah's perspective had fundamentally changed. I appreciate the offer, I said, but I'm not ready for that yet. What would make you ready? She asked, and I could hear disappointment in her voice. Time, consistency, proof that this isn't just another strategy to get back to the way things were. How can I prove that? By continuing to call without needing anything, by showing interest in my life over time, not just in one conversation, by demonstrating that you see me as a person worth knowing, not just a problem to be solved. Okay, she said quietly. I can do that. We'll see, I said, and I meant it kindly, but realistically. After we hung up, I felt a mixture of hope and wariness. Sarah's words had sounded genuine, but words were easy. The test would be whether her behavior changed consistently over time, or whether this conversation was just a detour on the way back to our old dynamic. 2 weeks later, she called again. This time, the conversation was different. She asked about my volunteer work and listened to my responses without trying to steer the conversation toward her own concerns. She told me about a book she was reading and asked if I had any recommendations. She shared a story about a funny incident at work without framing it as a crisis that needed my input. It was the kind of conversation I would have with a friend, not a bank account. David, meanwhile, remained silent. He was clearly waiting for the situation to resolve itself, for Sarah and me to work things out so he could return to the comfortable distance he preferred. His approach to family conflict had always been avoidance, and this situation was no different. I was learning to be okay with his absence. If David wasn't interested in a real relationship with me, I couldn't force one into existence. I could only control my own choices and boundaries. As summer turned to fall, I settled into a new routine that didn't revolve around my children's needs and crises. I continued volunteering at the Literacy Center, joined a book club at the local library, and started taking watercolor painting classes at a community college in Queens. The painting surprised me most of all. I had always been practical, focused on useful skills and necessary tasks. But mixing colors on a palette and watching them flow across paper felt like a form of magic I had never allowed myself to explore. My instructor, a patient woman named Carmen, who taught art to senior citizens, encouraged me to paint, without worrying about creating something recognizable or beautiful. Art is about expression, she told me during one of our sessions. It's about putting something of yourself into the world that wasn't there before. I painted abstract shapes that represented feelings I couldn't name. I painted landscapes that existed only in my imagination. I painted portraits of faces I had never seen but somehow recognized. The act of creating something purely for my own satisfaction, with no regard for whether it pleased or helped anyone else, felt revolutionary. My apartment slowly filled with my modest art, watercolors taped to the walls, sketchbooks stacked on my coffee table, brushes and paints arranged on a TV tray that had become my makeshift easel. For the first time in years, my living space felt like it reflected me rather than just housing my exhaustion. Sarah continued to call regularly, and slowly, cautiously, I began to trust that her interest in my life was genuine. She asked to see my paintings and responded with what seemed like real enthusiasm. She told me about her own creative struggles at work and asked for my perspective not as a solution provider, but as someone whose opinion she valued. We were building something new, tentative and fragile, but real in a way our relationship had never been before. But the real test came in November. Sarah called on a Tuesday evening, and I could hear tension in her voice from the first word. Mom, are you sitting down? My first instinct was familiar panic. Someone was sick, someone was hurt, someone needed money or help or rescue, but I forced myself to remain calm. I'm fine standing. What's going on? Marcus and I are getting divorced. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because I was shocked. The photos on the USB drive had prepared me for this possibility, but because I immediately felt my old patterns trying to reassert themselves. I wanted to ask what she needed from me, how I could help, what problems required my intervention. Instead, I asked, how are you feeling? Terrible, confused, angry, sad. It's been building for months, but I kept hoping we could work it out. He's been having an affair with someone he works with, and when I confronted him about it, he said he wanted out of the marriage. An affair. Interesting, given what I had seen in those wedding photos. I'm sorry you're going through this, I said. Divorce is painful even when it's the right choice. I don't know if it's the right choice, she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. I thought we were building a life together. I thought we were happy. I bit back the questions I wanted to ask about the man from the wedding photos, about the bank statements, about all the things I had seen but never confronted. This wasn't the time for investigative journalism. This was the time to offer emotional support. "What do you need right now?" I asked. Not practically, but emotionally. "How can I help you process this?" It was a different question than I had ever asked before, focused on her internal experience rather than external problems that needed solving. "I just need to talk to someone who knows me," she said. "Someone who won't judge me or try to fix everything. I need my mom. My mom. Not my bank account. Not my problem-solving service. Not my crisis management center. My mom." We talked for 2 hours. I listened as Sarah processed her feelings about the marriage, about Marcus, about her own choices and mistakes. I offered comfort and perspective, but no solutions, no money, no offers to swoop in and handle the logistics of her divorce. When she finally asked the question I had been dreading, "Mom, would it be possible for me to stay with you for a few weeks while I figure out my living situation?" I surprised both of us with my response. "I can't do that, Sarah." "What? Why not?" "Because my apartment is barely big enough for one person," I said truthfully. "But more importantly, because I think you need to learn how to handle this crisis yourself. I can be here to talk through your feelings and offer emotional support, but I can't solve your practical problems for you anymore. I'm not asking you to solve anything. I'm just asking for a place to sleep while I apartment hunt." "And what happens when apartment hunting takes longer than expected? What happens when you need help with deposits or moving expenses? What happens when the next crisis hits before you're stable?" "I wouldn't do that," she said, but even she didn't sound convinced. "Sarah, I believe that you don't want to do that, but our old pattern is so strong that it would be almost impossible to resist. You moving in with me would put us right back where we started." She was quiet for a long time. "So you're just going to let me figure this out alone?" she finally asked. "I'm going to let you figure it out as an adult," I said gently, "which is different from being alone. I'll be here to listen, to encourage you, to remind you that you're stronger than you think, but I won't be here to rescue you from the consequences of your choices or the challenges of your life." "I don't understand the difference," she said. "The difference is that one approach treats you like a capable adult who is temporarily struggling, and the other treats you like a helpless child who can't survive without intervention. What if I can't do it on my own? Then you'll figure out other resources, friends, social services, your own problem-solving abilities, but you won't know what you're capable of until you try." It was one of the hardest conversations I had ever had with my daughter, but also one of the most loving. I was respecting her capacity to grow and adapt, rather than enabling her dependence on me. Sarah did figure it out. She moved in with a friend temporarily, found her own apartment within 6 weeks, and handled her divorce proceedings without my financial intervention. She called regularly during this period, but the conversations were different. She was processing her emotions and sharing her experiences rather than outsourcing her problems. I watched from a careful distance as my daughter discovered her own strength and resilience. It was harder for both of us than my swooping in to fix everything, but it was also healthier and more respectful. David, meanwhile, had been completely absent during Sarah's crisis. When I mentioned to him during one of our infrequent phone calls that his sister was getting divorced, his response was typically detached. "That's too bad. I hope she's okay." "Have you talked to her?" I asked. "Not recently. I figured she'd call if she needed anything." It was a perfect encapsulation of David's approach to relationships. Passive, peripheral, engaged only when directly activated. He wasn't intentionally cruel, but his indifference was its own form of abandonment. I realized I couldn't change David any more than I could have changed Sarah without her willingness to participate. I could only control my own choices about how much energy to invest in a relationship with someone who showed no interest in reciprocating. By Christmas, my life looked completely different than it had a year earlier. Sarah and I were building a genuine relationship based on mutual respect and interest. David remained distant, but no longer made demands on my time or resources. My finances had stabilized now that I wasn't constantly funding other people's crises. My health had improved with reduced stress and better self-care. But the biggest change was internal. I had rediscovered myself as a person with interests, opinions, and desires that existed independently of my role as mother and caregiver. I was painting regularly now, and some of my work was good enough that Carmen had suggested I consider entering a local art show. I had made friends through my volunteer work and book club, people who knew me as Rose the person, not Rose the mother or Rose the helper. I was learning to enjoy my own company in a way I never had before. Evenings alone in my apartment were peaceful rather than lonely. I cooked meals I enjoyed, watched movies I wanted to see, read books that interested me rather than ones I thought would improve me or help me better serve others. For my 70th birthday in January, I did something unprecedented. I threw myself a party. Not a family gathering where I cooked and cleaned and worried about everyone else's comfort, but a real party where I was the guest of honor. I invited my new friends from book club, my fellow volunteers from the Literacy Center, my art class companions, and my neighbor Maria, who had been so kind during my darkest period. Sarah asked if she could come, and after some consideration, I said yes. David declined the invitation, claiming he was too busy with work, which didn't surprise me. The party was held at a community center in Flushing, with decorations I chose and music I loved and food I enjoyed. Instead of focusing on making sure everyone else was having a good time, I allowed myself to be celebrated. Sarah brought a thoughtful gift, a set of professional quality watercolor paints, and participated in the festivities without trying to make herself the center of attention. She seemed genuinely happy to meet my friends and learn about the life I had built, independent of my role as her mother. During the party, Carmen made a surprise announcement. The community college was organizing a group art show for their senior students, and she had submitted 3 of my paintings. They had been accepted for display, which meant my art would be shown publicly for the first time. The applause from my friends felt different from any approval I had ever received. This wasn't appreciation for my usefulness or gratitude for my sacrifices. This was recognition of my talent, my creativity, my individual worth as a person. Sarah hugged me afterward, tears in her eyes. "Mom, I'm so proud of you," she said. "Not just for the art show, but for everything. For building this life for yourself. For teaching me that I could be stronger than I thought I was. For showing me what real love looks like." "What does real love look like?" I asked. "Like respecting someone enough to let them grow instead of keeping them dependent. Like caring about their happiness more than your own comfort. Like believing in their ability to handle their own life." It was the most insightful thing I had ever heard her say about relationships, and it gave me hope that the changes between us were permanent rather than temporary. The art show was held in March, and it was one of the most nervous and exciting experiences of my life. Seeing my paintings hung on gallery walls with little plaques containing my name and the titles I had given them felt surreal. People I didn't know stopped to look at my work and discuss it with their companions. Some of them asked Carmen about my techniques or artistic background. A few asked if my pieces were for sale. For sale. The idea that someone might want to own something I had created purely for the joy of creating it was revolutionary. I sold 2 paintings that night for more money than I had ever imagined my art could be worth. But more importantly, I had proven to myself that I was capable of creating something valuable and meaningful that had nothing to do with serving anyone else's needs. Sarah attended the art show and brought Marcus's replacement, a quiet, kind man named James who worked as a librarian and treated her with obvious respect and affection. She introduced me to him as my mother, the artist, and the pride in her voice was unmistakable. David sent a text message saying congratulations but didn't attend, which no longer surprised or wounded me. I had accepted that we would never have the close relationship I had once wanted, but I was no longer willing to exhaust myself trying to force a connection he wasn't interested in maintaining. As spring turned to summer, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed in the 2 years since Sarah's wedding. The USB drive that had revealed my family's true feelings about me had been devastating at the time, but it had also been a gift. Without that painful awakening, I might have continued sacrificing myself indefinitely, growing smaller and more invisible until I disappeared entirely. The woman I had become, independent, creative, boundaried, respected, would have been impossible without the destruction of the woman I had been. Accommodating, depleted, exploited, dismissed. Sometimes destruction is the only path to authentic reconstruction. My relationship with Sarah continued to develop in positive directions. She had learned to navigate her own challenges without expecting me to provide solutions or funding. She called regularly, not because she needed anything, but because she enjoyed our conversations. She showed genuine interest in my art, my volunteer work, my thoughts and feelings about topics that had nothing to do with her. When she announced her engagement to James 18 months after her divorce was finalized, her approach was completely different from her first wedding planning experience. "We want something small and simple," she told me. "Just immediate family and a few close friends. We're going to have it in the community garden in Brooklyn where we met, and we're handling all the costs ourselves." "That sounds perfect," I said, and I meant it. "We'd love for you to be there, and we'd love for you to bring some of your friends if you want. Carmen, Maria, whoever you'd like to include. We want to celebrate with people who really know and care about us, not put on a show for people we barely talk to." This was the daughter I had hoped Sarah would become. Thoughtful, self-sufficient, genuinely interested in building authentic relationships rather than impressive events. The wedding was beautiful in its simplicity. 25 people gathered in a community garden on a sunny Saturday morning in June. Sarah wore a sundress she bought at a department store for $60. James wore a suit he already owned. They exchanged vows they had written together, focusing on partnership and mutual support rather than fairy tale romance. I brought Carmen and Maria as my guests, and they were welcomed warmly by Sarah and James. The ceremony was followed by a potluck picnic in the garden, with everyone contributing food and conversation. For the first time in my life, I felt like an honored guest at my daughter's wedding rather than UN unpaid event coordinator. During the reception, Sarah pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Mom, I need to tell you something I should have said years ago." "What's that?" "I'm sorry. For taking you for granted, for using you, for treating you like a convenience instead of a person. I'm sorry for all the years I wasted being selfish when I could have been getting to know you." "Apology accepted," I said, and I meant it completely. "I also want to thank you for saving me." "Saving you from what?" "From myself. From never learning to be an adult. From never discovering what I was capable of when I couldn't rely on someone else to solve my problems. If you hadn't stopped enabling me, I would have stayed dependent forever. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done," I admitted. "Saying no to you went against every instinct I had as your mother. But it was the most loving thing you could have done," she said, even though I couldn't see it at the time. We hugged in the middle of that community garden, surrounded by vegetables and flowers that people had planted and tended with their own hands. It felt like a perfect metaphor for what we had done with our relationship, destroyed the artificial dependencies and grown something organic and sustainable in their place. David attended the wedding but remained characteristically peripheral. He was polite to everyone, participated in the group photos, and left immediately after the ceremony ended. His distance no longer felt like a rejection of me personally. It was simply who he was, and I had made peace with loving him from whatever distance he required. As I write this, 3 years have passed since that devastating USB drive arrived at my door. My life today is unrecognizable from the life I was living then. I still work as a home health aide, but only part-time and only for patients I genuinely want to help. The work feels meaningful again now that it's a choice rather than a desperate scramble for survival money. I've become serious about my art, participating in several group shows and even having a small solo exhibition at a coffee shop in Astoria. I've sold enough paintings to supplement my income modestly, but more importantly, I found a source of joy and self-expression that belongs entirely to me. My apartment is still small, but it's filled with color and life now. My artwork on the walls, plants on the windowsills, books and art supplies that reflect my interests rather than just functional necessities. Sarah and I talk several times a week, not because either of us needs anything, but because we enjoy each other's company. She's thriving in her second marriage and has started her own small fashion design business that's actually profitable. When she faces challenges, she handles them herself or turns to her husband for support, treating me as a confidant rather than a crisis intervention service. David and I have found a sustainable equilibrium. We exchange holiday cards and birthday calls, and he visits occasionally when he's in the area. Our relationship lacks depth, but it also lacks drama and exploitation. Sometimes that's the best that's possible with certain people, and I've learned to appreciate peace over intensity. I've made real friends, people who seek out my company because they enjoy who I am, not because I can solve their problems or fund their dreams. These relationships feel lighter and more nourishing than the heavy, need-based connections that had characterized so much of my earlier life. Looking back, I can see that my journey from martyrdom to independence wasn't just about learning to say no to unreasonable demands. It was about rediscovering my own worth as an individual human being, rather than just a supporting character in other people's stories. The woman who received that USB drive 3 years ago was dying, not physically, but spiritually and emotionally. She had given away so much of herself that there was barely anything left to give. She was invisible even to herself, existing only in relation to other people's needs and crises. The woman I am today is vibrantly alive. I have opinions, interests, boundaries, and dreams. I take up space in the world intentionally rather than apologetically. I create beauty and meaning that didn't exist before I put my energy into it. Most importantly, I've learned the difference between love and self-sacrifice. Real love respects the autonomy and dignity of both people in the relationship. It doesn't require anyone to disappear or become depleted in service to someone else's comfort. The people who truly love me want me to be happy and fulfilled, not just useful. They're interested in my thoughts and experiences, not just my resources and services. They see me as a complete person worthy of care and consideration, not a partial person whose only value lies in what I can provide. This understanding has revolutionized not only my relationship with my children, but my relationship with myself. I no longer measure my worth by how much I can give or how useful I can be. I measure it by how authentic I can be, how much beauty I can create, how well I can respect both my own boundaries and those of others. The transformation wasn't easy. There were nights when the loneliness felt unbearable, when I wondered if demanding respect was worth the risk of losing my family entirely. There were moments when my old patterns of people-pleasing and self-sacrifice felt so much safer than the uncertainty of building something new. But every step toward independence and self-respect, even the painful ones, brought me closer to a life that felt genuinely mine, rather than borrowed or performed for someone else's approval. The hardest lesson was learning that some people will only maintain relationships with you if you allow them to exploit you. Discovering that your own children might be among those people is devastating, but it's also liberating. Once you know the truth, you can make informed choices about how to proceed rather than operating from desperate hope and denial. Sarah chose to grow and change when I stopped enabling her dependency. David chose to maintain his distance when I stopped accommodating his indifference. Both responses gave me valuable information about who they really were and what kinds of relationships were possible with each of them. I couldn't control their choices, but I could control my response to them. I could choose to respect myself enough to demand respect from others. I could choose to build a life that existed independently of their approval or participation. I could choose to become someone I was proud to be rather than just someone others found useful. The community I found, through art classes, volunteer work, book clubs, and support groups, taught me that there are people in the world who will appreciate you for who you are, rather than what you can do for them. These relationships feel fundamentally different from the transactional interactions that had dominated my earlier life. When Carmen invites me to coffee, it's because she enjoys my conversation, not because she needs me to solve a problem. When Maria checks on me after I've been sick, it's because she cares about my well-being, not because she wants something from me. When my book club friends laugh at my observations about a novel we're discussing, it's because they find my perspective interesting, not because they're managing my feelings. These authentic connections have shown me what I was missing in my relationships with my own family. The people who genuinely care about you want to know your thoughts, your feelings, your experiences. They remember details about your life and ask follow-up questions about things you've told them. They show up when you need support, but they also celebrate your successes and share in your joys. Building this kind of community took time and intention. I had to learn how to be a friend rather than just a helper, how to receive care as well as give it, how to show interest in others without trying to fix their problems. But the investment was worth it. At 75 years old, I have the richest social life I've ever had. Not because I'm surrounded by the most people, but because I'm surrounded by people who actually see and value me as an individual. My daily routine now reflects this transformation. I wake up each morning with a sense of purpose that comes from within rather than from other people's demands. I might spend the morning painting, the afternoon volunteering at the literacy center, and the evening reading a book or calling a friend just to chat. Each activity is chosen because it brings me joy or fulfillment, not because it serves someone else's agenda. This may sound selfish to people who are still trapped in patterns of chronic self-sacrifice, but it's actually the foundation of healthy relationships. When you have a strong sense of your own identity and worth, you can engage with others from a place of strength and choice rather than desperation and obligation. You can offer genuine support when it's appropriate without depleting yourself. You can maintain boundaries without feeling guilty. You can love people without losing yourself. The financial stability I've achieved since stopping my pattern of endless giving has been another revelation. Without the constant drain of other people's emergencies and desires, I've been able to pay down my debts, rebuild some savings, and even afford small luxuries that enhance my quality of life. I can afford to buy good art supplies now. I can go to museums and concerts without worrying about the admission fees. I can replace worn-out clothes instead of making do with items that no longer fit properly or make me feel good about myself. These may seem like trivial improvements, but they've had a profound impact on my self-esteem and sense of dignity. When you stop treating yourself like an afterthought, other people stop treating you that way too. Even my health has improved dramatically since I reduced the stress in my life. My blood pressure has stabilized, my chronic headaches have mostly disappeared, and I have more energy than I've had in years. The connection between emotional well-being and physical health is real and powerful. As I reflect on this journey, I'm struck by how much of my earlier life was motivated by fear. Fear of being unlovable, fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of my own needs and desires. Those fears led me to make choices that ultimately created the very outcomes I was trying to avoid. By trying so hard to be indispensable, I made myself invisible. By avoiding conflict at all costs, I created relationships filled with resentment and exploitation. By neglecting my own needs, I became someone who had nothing authentic to offer others. The courage to face those fears and make different choices was terrifying at first, but it's been the most important work of my life. Learning to tolerate uncertainty and temporary loneliness in service of something better was infinitely preferable to the permanent dysfunction I had been accept with authentic connection has been one of the greatest gifts of my later life. To anyone listening to this story who recognizes their own situation in my experience, I want you to know that change is possible at any age and at any stage of relationships. It's never too late to start respecting yourself enough to demand respect from others. It's never too late to discover who you are beneath the roles you've been performing for other people. The process isn't easy, and it doesn't come with guarantees about how others will respond. Some people, like Sarah, may rise to the occasion and build something better with you. Others, like David, may choose to maintain their distance, rather than engage with the real you. Still, others may become angry or manipulative when you stop allowing them to exploit you. But regardless of how others respond, you will have the satisfaction of knowing that you're living authentically, making choices that align with your values, and treating yourself with the dignity that every human being deserves. The alternative, continuing to sacrifice yourself for relationships that drain rather than nourish you, doesn't actually preserve those relationships. It just preserves a dysfunctional dynamic that benefits some people while destroying others. Real relationships can withstand the stress of growth and change. People who genuinely care about you will want you to be happy and fulfilled, even if that requires them to adjust their expectations or behavior. People who only value you for what you can provide will resist any change that threatens their access to your resources. Discovering which category your loved ones fall into can be heartbreaking, but it's also liberating. Once you know the truth, you can make informed decisions about how to proceed, rather than operating from hope and denial. For me, the most unexpected gift of this transformation has been discovering my own creativity and capacity for joy. The woman who spent decades focused only on serving others had no idea that she had artistic talent, that she could find deep satisfaction in volunteer work, that she could build meaningful friendships based on mutual interest and respect. Those aspects of myself couldn't emerge until I created space for them by stepping back from my role as the family's universal problem solver and ATM. Saying no to others' excessive demands allowed me to say yes to my own growth and happiness. Every choice to prioritize my well-being over someone else's comfort has led to discoveries about who I really am and what brings meaning to my life. Every boundary I've maintained has created room for something better to grow in the space that was previously occupied by dysfunction. Looking forward, I'm excited about possibilities I couldn't have imagined 3 years ago. I'm planning to travel to see an art exhibition in Washington, D.C. next month, my first trip taken purely for my own pleasure in decades. I'm considering taking a creative writing class to explore whether I might enjoy expressing myself through words as well as images. Sarah and James have invited me to spend Thanksgiving with them and his family, which feels like an honor rather than an obligation. I'm looking forward to meeting people who know me as Sarah's talented, independent mother, rather than as someone who needs to be managed or tolerated. Most of all, I'm looking forward to continuing to discover who I am when I'm not defined by my usefulness to others. At 75 years old, I feel like I'm just getting started on the most authentic chapter of my life. The woman who received that devastating USB drive 3 years ago couldn't have imagined that betrayal would lead to liberation, that loss would lead to discovery, that saying no would finally teach her how to say yes to herself. But life has a way of offering us exactly the challenges we need to become who we're meant to be, even when those challenges feel like punishments at the time. The key is staying open to the possibility that destruction can clear the way for something better, and that it's never too late to start building a life that truly belongs to you. So I ask you, whoever you are listening to this, have you ever lived something like what I've shared with you today? Have you found yourself giving and giving until there was nothing left of you? Have you confused love with sacrifice or care with depletion? Maybe you're in the thick of it right now, answering every call for help, saying yes to every request, slowly disappearing under the weight of everyone else's needs and expectations. Maybe you're wondering if you're selfish for wanting something different, if you're bad mother or father or spouse or child for feeling resentful about always being the one who gives. Or maybe you know someone who's trapped in this pattern, someone who has become invisible in their own life, whose worth is measured only by what they can provide rather than who they are as a person. What did you think as you listened to my story? What resonated with you, and what felt different from your own experience? I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. And if this story touched something in you, if it helped you feel less alone or gave you something to think about, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. Knowing that these words reached someone who needed to hear them is what gives me the courage to keep sharing my heart. Sometimes the most important thing we can do for each other is simply say, "You're not crazy. You're not selfish. You deserve better." And it's not too late to claim the life that's really yours. Thank you for listening.